Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is actually going to continue the Kumazawa Banzan series, but before we continue that series, I felt the need to present this video to discuss a topic which is often overlooked and or misunderstood. That topic is the Ronin. So let's start with the fact that there are actually two types of Ronin, and it's very important to distinguish these two types. Now, as a rule, I work hard to attempt to clarify historical mistakes without calling anybody out, and I'm not going to call anybody out, but I have seen these mistakes appear in some research, and I also see these mistakes appear in the sort of casual samurai fan community. So basically, with all due respect, let's address this topic, and at least for the viewers of this channel, let's correct the misunderstanding of the word and its actual meanings. So look at your screen and you're going to see the two types of Ronin. Now the first one is the one that everyone is familiar with. It means, wave man, Ronin. The second one is also pronounced Ronin, but it means hard or tough man. So we'll get to that in a second. But the first one, wave man, this is when everyone thinks of a wandering samurai with no master, they think of this. But this word actually doesn't have it doesn't denote samurai status at all. The word wave man, Ronin in this case, it refers to any vagrant, any drifter. They could even be of common status. Anybody who's a drifter or a vagabond is a wave man. When we're thinking of masterless samurai, what we're really thinking of is this term, this term, hard or jail man, is actually from like the 1400s and the 1500s. This is actually the masterless samurai term. Now this term would eventually merge with wave man, type that with the wave man, but before masterless samurai is merged with the concept of wave man, this was the actual term, tough man. Now, because the first kanji can mean hard or strong or tough, but it can also mean jail, there are many people who have made the mistake of translating this term as prisoner. They see what they think is jail man and they read it as prisoner, but it doesn't even make sense. Like even in the context of what they're talking about, it doesn't make sense. But I've seen it where someone would say, so-and-so had an issue with their lord and then they became a Ronin. But they've mistranslated as so-and-so had an issue with their lord and then they went to jail or they became a prisoner. That's not at all what it means. It means that they had an issue with their lord and they left their lord's service. So you're not supposed to read it as jail man or prison man. You're supposed to read it as hard or strong. Like if you want to combine the two concepts, you can be like prison made him tough, right? That kind of tough. So the idea is that he's tough because he's existing without a master. So as I said, wave man doesn't denote anything other than the person's a drifter. Like I said, it wasn't until the Edo period that this really took on the meaning of a masterless samurai. Tough man, that Ronin. This is the way to read and write Ronin that is correct for a masterless samurai. This is from 1400s, 1500s. This term, this version of Ronin, the tough man, that automatically denotes a masterless samurai. So, was a masterless samurai also a drifter? And the answer is not always. Many pre-Edo periods Ronin were well situated in their family property and oftentimes purposefully left their lord when they no longer felt like serving that person. For whatever reason, they would just not like their lord, or they would have a disagreement with the lord, or it's even possible the lord doesn't like them, so they're dismissed, but for whatever reason, the person is no longer in service. Like I said, either they're let go or they themselves willfully walk away from the employment. So it's best to understand Ronin more like an independent contractor rather than a wandering and impoverished drifter. Because again, wandering and impoverished drifter doesn't really explain the Ronin of the 14 and 1500s. It's just not accurate. Most of the Ronin of that time period were well off. They were well to do. They had money, they had servants, they had, like, property, etc., etc. They weren't drifters by any stretch of the imagination. So many samurai pre-Edo, and many samurai pre-Edo, many samurai spent some time being Ronin. Either going from master to master, several masters in one lifetime, or serve a master for a while. That master might die. They don't have a master for a little bit. They pick one up a few years later. That was very common for samurai throughout the 1500s. Some of these Ronin even managed to become small-time daimyo. You have some, they go through a couple masters and then eventually they say, to hell with it, and they sort of formulate their own force and become a small-time daimyo themselves. Very so the idea of a Ronin during the 14 and 1500s being this sort of impoverished wanderer is just simply not correct. Ronin of that time period are just independent contractors. They're samurai who they don't have a lord. We'll discuss that more in another slide, but I'll give you an example of my own. To use the Nojiri family as an example, right? Several Nojiri were Ronin during the 1500s. Many of the Nojiri were Ronin during the 1500s. In fact, it's very common for most of the Nojiri to either be a Ronin multiple times or to simply be a Ronin for the majority of their career or lifetime. And this isn't just unique to the Nojiri. This is pretty common. Again, but we'll go into these reasons. Like I will explain in the next slides how all this works. So let's start off this slide going straight to it. There's no negative social stigma with being a Ronin pre-Edo period. As long as your family was strong and financially stable enough, you did not have to serve any lord. Or another way to conceptualize it is you were serving your own family, your own house. Like if your family was strong, if you had property and money and servants, you didn't need to serve a lord, right? If you could afford to run your samurai house without serving a lord, then you didn't need a lord. Simple as that. But at this same time period, again, we're in the pre-Edo period, pre-1600 period. The waveman Ronin did have a negative stigma, a negative social stigma around that waveman Ronin. Because again, at this time period, the waveman might be a samurai or they might be a commoner. And the term usually, like I said, it does mean wanderer, vagrant, drifter. And it was this waveman who at this time has the reputation of being a thief or a troublemaker. All right, so we have two very distinctive. We have independent contractors or samurai who are powerful and wealthy enough that they don't need a master, so they serve their own house. They serve themselves. They serve their own house. That is Ronin, masterless samurai. But then you have also pronounced Ronin. You have these vagrant drifters that may or may not be samurai. So how is it that these two different things become the same thing eventually? So let's get into that. And quite a lot changed. We're going to focus on three significant factors. Number one, the end of the Age of War, so around the time of Toyotomi. Two, the beginning of the Tokugawa reign, so 1600. Three, the follow-up government procedures after the siege of Osaka, 1615s, right? So these three are by no means the totality, but they're the three main points that we're going to look at that best encapsulates the changes. Again, like I said, this is a very simplified explanation, but these 3 points pretty much capture the story. So with these 3 points, once we go over these 3 points, then it'll make the evolution of the term, it'll make more sense. So the end of the warring age. So this was Toyotomi's policies. So pre-Toyotomi, daimyo needed a lot of warriors. The country was one giant tinderbox, one giant civil war. And remember, everything's a civil war, and Nobunaga wants to unify the country, but he dies before he's successful. Toyotomi comes up and finishes it. So prior to Toyotomi, one massive tinderbox. But now with there's no need for policies to regulate the size of an army, and samurai could choose to serve a lord for life, or to hop from lord to lord, or simply just mercenary work to whoever wanted or could pay their fees. And that was the reality of the warring period. There was such a need for warriors that there was this freedom for warriors to serve as they felt. However, with the end of the warring period, getting into Toyotomi's policies, there became a need to slim down the military power of the various lords, and this led to several legal policies and social reforms, many of which froze social mobility and changed the hiring patterns. At this time, many samurai who were Ronin get converted into something called Goshi. And this is a special type of samurai, also called Ji samurai, or this is the country samurai. So they are Ronin, and now they are a special type of samurai. So these are kind of, like I said, them being Ronin hasn't changed, but now they are a special type of samurai. They're a Goshi samurai, which is a lower level samurai. And let's talk about those changes some more. Let's talk about Goshi though for a second. So Goshi, which means country samurai, is a difficult term to discuss. It can potentially have several different interpretations and meanings that's changed slightly based on the context. However, in this context, in this case, it absolutely means a person of the samurai class. But in this particular case, we're referring to a samurai who, despite their actual wealth, they are now socially lower because of the legal distance from the government, meaning that they are country samurai as opposed to urban samurai. Some of them are employed by lords, some of them are ronin or masterless. But the point is that some of these Goshi, like I said, some of them were samurai, but some of them were employed samurai. Some of them were even daimyo. But during the policy changes and government reforms, whether they were Ronin, whether they were employed, or whether they were certain daimyo, they end up becoming Goshi, which is a lower rung of the status. So the closer you are to the government, the higher your status. The further you are from the government, you have a lower status. It doesn't really have anything to do with the amount of money or ability you have. It's about your distance from the central government. I should also add to the point that these Goshi that I'm talking about, these Ronin these Goshi Ronin, their status as samurai is officially registered, and they're even confirmed by the lords of their respective domains. So even though they are not serving the lord of that domain, but their property is in that lord's domain, that lord still certifies them as samurai. Now let's look at the start of the Edo period, the pre-Osaka campaign. So when Toyotomi's reforms came through, social mobility was frozen, people were turned Goshi, the people were reorganized in terms of their status within the samurai class, etc., etc. But now when we get into the start of the Edo period, which is pre-Osaka campaign, so we're looking at 1600 to like 1613-ish. This is after Sekigahara, but before the siege of Osaka. During this time period, the Ronin still operated, right? So you still had these Ronin families or Ronin individuals. They were still samurai, as we just explained, but due to the changes brought about by the Tokugawa's new policies, because now with Sekigahara, Tokugawa's in charge, so Tokugawa starts to make their own policy. So these new policies are what actually cause the Ronin to become less economically sound. Tokugawa had stricter measures, far stricter than Toyotomi's measures. So these strict measures were social and economic measures. And this is where the Ronin began to have a much harder time getting employed and finding work. Basically there's no more battles, and there's very little need for any domain lords to hire any new retainers or mercenaries. But aside from there being very little need, the Tokugawa government also begins to place strict laws in place that prevents the hiring of such individuals. And it's at this point that slowly the economy of the Ronin begins to erode. But now the Ronin are still operating, and we'll get into the kind of things that the Ronin did from 1600 to the Siege of Osaka. But let's jump to the third point, Siege of Osaka. Because the Ronin began to have less and less economic ventures available to them, this is when poverty and strife begin to set in. So it's between 1600 and the 1615 period that the tough man Ronin begins to merge with the wave man Ronin. So this is the time when many impoverished samurai began wandering the country looking for work. This is how the kanji wave man comes to be used for masterless samurai. So it's at this point that tough man, as the kanji for Ronin, begins to sort of disappear, and wave man, which means drifter, becomes the kanji used for a masterless samurai. This is the time period. So many of these wave men gathered to support the Toyotomi during the Osaka siege, because Toyotomi was technically the actual leader of the country. Toyotomi was Tokugawa's master, and Toyotomi hired many of these Ronin because Tokugawa said that he couldn't hire them, but Toyotomi said, no, I am actually the leader of the country and I will hire who I want. So he calls all of these Ronin to Osaka. But unfortunately, the Toyotomi faction loses the siege of Osaka, and thousands of these Ronin die. They either die in the battle, many are executed afterwards. It's pretty gruesome. After this battle, the Tokugawa government makes the rules against Ronin even tighter. So now let's look at some of the takeaways from these points. So 1. Originally, a samurai could leave service at will. The need for warriors was very high, and even serving as a mercenary your entire life was economically viable for a samurai. But, number 2, the need for warriors falls off. Restrictions on hiring new warriors for the purpose of controlling the size of the province's armies. This also locks out several samurai from jobs. Mercenary work still takes place, but it doesn't pay as well, and it's harder and harder to get because there's less and less need for it overall. And then 3, between 1600 and 1650, the Tokugawa laws were very strict and strangled the Ronin population. So, like I said in a previous slide, let's look at what the Ronin were doing in the 1600s. So, prior to 1600s, the Ronin, as I said, were masterless samurai who either hopped from lord to lord or did mercenary work. There's nothing about them that has anything to do with drifting or wandering. Like, as you the viewer hopefully understand now, that entire concept of drifting or wandering is from the Edo period. During the Sengoku period, a Ronin probably has a mansion and servants and many family members, and it has a small army surrounding them. So very different reality. So let's look at the Ronin after the government restrictions. What are they doing after the government restrictions are put in place? What are they doing during the 1600s? Well, they actually lay the groundwork for a lot of social and cultural change and revolutions in Japan. So the first and foremost, obviously, is the Kien Revolt in the 1650s. Now, this is a Ronin revolt led by Yui Shosetsu. So Yui Shosetsu is the head of Nankiryu, aka Kusunoki Ryugungaku. He is a Ronin, and he leads a Ronin revolt in the 1650s to force the government to allow the Ronin to be rehired by the Provincial Lords. And even though the revolt fails, it still forces the government to allow Ronin to be rehired. And when this happens, many Ronin get employed. So right then and there, many Ronin just get reemployed. But those who did not get reemployed, that continued on as Ronin, they are responsible for things like political commentaries. Well, I should actually say, before the Kien Revolt, they're doing this. So I'm going to give a list of things. You see this list at the bottom. These are things that Ronin started doing early in the 1600s. And then in the 1650s, when Ronin were allowed to get hired again, many just got hired again, but those that maintained their status as Ronin continued to develop these things that are on this list. So they are things like political commentaries, Gungaku and Heiho schools, military teachings, military schools, martial arts schools, things like that. They also help establish things called terakoya, which is a school often held in temples, thus tera at the beginning, temple. Basically like temple school, right? These are schools for commoners, and this taught math and reading to the common people. This is a big deal. You know, when you think about this, this is a big social change. The commoners are being taught by monks and Ronin how to read and write and do math. That's big. So about political commentaries. So the entire Kumazawa Banzan video series that is being presented on this channel is addressing this. Basically, since a Ronin doesn't have to worry about being fired for talking, they can assess and report the real issues of the government and its policies. They can be critical to the government. Sure, they may face jail time or they may face their written words being banned, but they don't have to worry about getting fired because they're Ronin. They're also involved in religious development, as a Ronin could develop a lot of time, the Ronin could devote a lot of time toward religious pursuits, such as Buddhism or Confucianism. So there are many Confucian scholars who are Ronin, like Kumazawa Banzan, who are Ronin. But you also have a lot of Ronin that get deep into Buddhism as well. And then you get Ronin, well, the famous, one of the most famous Ronin of all time. I really don't even want to mention his name because he's talked about ad nauseum. But even Musashi, he spends all of his time doing military, martial arts, and Buddhism because he's a Ronin. He has all this time to devote to Buddhism and to martial arts. And that leads into the next part, Gungaku and Heiho. So the reality that a lot of people miss, and so let me just say this directly, the reality is this: most of the warfare schools are started and run by Ronin. Things like Koshu-ryu and Kusunoki-ryu, the two biggest Gungaku schools during the early Edo period, they're both started and run by Ronin. This also leads to an interesting dynamic because Ronin had to outcompete each other for students and for political and economic attention. This caused a massive flourishing of martial arts and warfare tactics and other things, poetry and political ideologies, etc., etc. Just massive flourishing of thoughts in these different disciplines during the 1600s. After the siege of Osaka, many of the surviving Ronin opened Gungaku schools. Right? So Obata Sensei, who had been or who was a Ronin hired by the Tokugawa. So Obata Sensei was a Ronin who, as a mercenary, was hired as a mercenary by the Tokugawa during the siege of Osaka. But because he did so well, they paid him as a private contractor to teach Gungaku. And this is the origin of Koshu-ryu. The entire reason that Koshu-ryu became a massive Gungaku institution is because Obata Sensei was hired as a mercenary by the Tokugawa and he impressed them. So then they said, oh, wow, Ronin, we're impressed. Here's some money. Open a school. And thus Koshu-ryu was born. Kusunoki-ryu, Gungaku, aka Nankiryu, was started by Kusunoki Fuden, and then it was taken over by Yui Shosetsu when Fuden died. Both Fuden and Yui were Ronin. So again, let me cut straight to the point. The massive explosion of warfare tactics and martial arts during the 1600s is not due to samurai who were serving their lords. Many of the schools, the manuals, the trainings, etc., etc., many of it, most of it in fact, came from Ronin, who were, to be fair, outpacing their employed counterparts in all things military. Now, I should say that there are some schools that were started by samurai who were employed by their lord. For example, the Natori-ryu, aka Shin-Kusunoki, that was a school started by an employed samurai. But the Kusunoki that Natori got, that came from Ronin. And as I said, in the main, overall, the Ronin instructors were simply outperforming the hired samurai, because the hired samurai have day jobs. They have things they have to do as their job, whereas the Ronin can devote all their time to that study. And as I said, the Ronin were also pushing ahead in religious studies and political ideologies as well. So the hard fact, the reality is that the Ronin were outpacing the employed samurai in warfare studies, martial arts, political commentaries, etc., etc., etc. They were outpacing them. So what changed though? Because this was in the 1600s. But why does this flourishing slow down and stop by the 1700s? It's actually a very simple answer. Many of the children of these Ronin had been hired by provincial lords, and the creative freedom of the Ronin begins to disappear as the torch is passed to the next generation. So, person A is a very creative Ronin who's outpacing all of the employed samurai, but his son is an employed samurai. So then as man A dies and the torch passes to man B, which would be his son, man B, he's employed. He can't be as free and creative as his father was. So the sons of Ronin are mostly employed by the lords, and so as these Ronin begin to age, the government, which this would be in the late 1600s, the government begins to also slowly tighten their grips on this creativity as well. So not only are the sons of Ronins who are now employed not able to be as creative, but the government begins to get a little bit more oppressive with the amount of creativity that they're going to allow. For example, institutions such as the Mito domain scholars, who, in all fairness, the Mito domain scholars started off as a good thing. They had this very noble idea to sort of separate good, authentic, legit material from nonsense material. But even they eventually turn into a form of thought police, and they start banning books and closing down schools and groups that they deem to be problematic. Like I said, in the beginning, they were really good about differentiating sort of fiction from fact, but it didn't take very long for them to just turn into a thought police who just started banning books and banning organizations for political reasons. So this is really how the creative phase of the Ronin fades in the early 1700s, and by the mid 1700s, pretty much all the creativity is gone. Like I said, the sons of Ronin can't be as creative. The government institutes more thought police measures, and by the 1700s, it's pretty much plateaued out. It's over. Ironically, the Edo period began with deep issues surrounding the Ronin, meaning their social strangulation and their flourishing of creativity and their ideas in military, poetry, politics, etc., etc., etc. But the Edo period also ends with the Ronin, as it was many disgruntled samurai, most of them Goshi, country samurai, who willfully cast off their employment and fought for the Meiji Restoration. Meaning that when you're thinking about the samurai who joined the Meiji Restoration, there's a massive group of them, a huge chunk of them are country samurai who willfully become Ronin so that they can pursue the goal of giving the country back to the emperor. And as we know, they win. The Meiji warriors win, and the Tokugawa shogunate disappears into history. One might say that it was the Tokugawa's attempts to strangle the creativity and the spirit of the Bushi, the Ronin in particular, which eventually caused the shogun's downfall. So the point of this video, as I said, is to make sure that you understand the reality of Ronin. It's a word that gets misused and overused and incorrectly used quite a lot. So what you need to understand is that many samurai chose the life of Ronin rather than serving a lord that they did not wish to fight for. And in the beginning, it was normal for a samurai to go from lord to lord. Many samurai did stick with one master their whole lives, but many did not. Many samurai, actually, these Ronin, operated from their own family mansions and they took jobs as needed. But regulations during the quote-unquote time of peace forced these non-employed samurai into either poverty or into the creative boom of the 1600s, this flourishing of martial arts and religious ideas and politics. So let's close by refocusing our vision. So in a previous video I had said that there was a text that said, for shinobi work, hire a Ronin. And some people interpreted that as meaning, it's dirty work, hire a scumbag drifter. It's kind of like a derogatory, kind of dismissive statement. But for shinobi work, hire Ronin, it doesn't mean this is dirty work, hire some random drifter, right? That's not what it means. What it means is something more like, this is delicate work that requires a specialist. You may have someone trained in this within your ranks, but that person is already employed and busy doing something else. It's best to hire an outside specialist. That way, you know their work is solid and you don't have to worry about giving up one of your payroll employees to do this. In other words, when a text says, for shinobi work, hire Ronin, it within the context of the actual historical realities of the time, it's basically saying, look, this requires a specialist. Go out and hire someone who is known to be a specialist in this field. AKA, go hire one of these Ronin shinobi who is known for being a master of the field and then like I said, at the same time, it's just you're hiring a specialist is what that really means. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations.